My name is Mark Sheeland. I'm Director of Programs and Government Relations at MEI, relatively new in the job, just in my second month, and very pleased for the first time to have the honor to introduce panelists at an MEI function. I'll introduce the experts who will talk to us over the next 90 minutes or so. Their biographic notes are in the flyer that I hope you all picked up, each of you picked up when you arrived, also on our website. So I will say simply, in alphabetical order, our panelists are Mr. Khush Choksy, Vice President for Turkey and Middle East Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Hisham Fahmy, Chief Executive Officer of the American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt, Mr. Chris Jarvis, Mission Chief for Egypt at the International Monetary Fund, Ms. Amal Kandeel, Founder and Director of Pioneers International, an international business development and advisory services company. Our moderator today is Ms. Randa Fahmy, founder and president of Fahmy Hudome International, a strategic consulting firm. She is an attorney and public policy professional with congressional and executive branch experience. The recent Egypt Economic Development Conference in Sharm El-Sheikh, the Sharm Summit, as we refer to it in the title of today's panel, resulted in a publicized total of $60 billion in investment agreements and pledges to support Egypt's economic renewal. A prospering and modernizing Egyptian economy can be vital for the entire Middle East. So MEI is very pleased to have gathered this group of energetic and exceedingly qualified people to share their insights and expectations. We expect a very interesting and useful discussion about Egypt's economic reform achievements to date and how to sustain progress and broaden opportunities for employment and business growth in Egypt and for international investors. Before yielding the floor to Randa, I would like to call your attention to two upcoming events in MEI's public programming. The day after tomorrow, Friday, April 24th at 3 p.m., we will look at reverberations of the recent Israeli election in a panel discussion with Ilan Peleg, Shibli Telhami, Ghaith Al-Omri, Lara Friedman, and moderator Dan Serwer. Our panel title asks the rhetorical question, who makes the case for peace? Details about the venue just down the block from here at Johns Hopkins SAIS are available on our website. And next Thursday, April 30th at midday in this building, we will host the mayor of Bethlehem, Ms. Vera Baboun, for a talk on local government and citizen participation in the West Bank. With that, I thank you again, all of you, for joining us today, and ask our moderator, Ms. Randa Fahmy, to lead us through the discussion ahead.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And I'd like to thank Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for hosting us here today. It's so lovely they allowed the use of their facilities. So in the Middle Eastern sort of hospitality way, we thank them for that. But of course, for Middle East Institute, both Wendy and Mark, for having the foresight, frankly, to put this panel together. As we can see, many of you in the audience are interested in this. We have also viewers from across the world who are watching as well. There's a great deal of interest, certainly, in what happened. For those of you who were not at the summit, I think the panelists here today will give you a front row seat to what happened at that summit and what the outcomes were. So I can tell by the mix of folks that are in the audience today where that interest is coming from, both the public and private sectors. And folks do want to know what the investment environment is like today in Egypt. So we'll be walking you through several aspects of that investment environment today. We're going to be hearing from four distinguished panelists, and then I will ask each of them a question, and certainly I will open it up to audience questions after their remarks. We do ask that when you do stand up and identify yourself, please ask your question. Also, a little housekeeping note here. I think I hear somebody's phone going off. If I can ask everybody to please shut your phones off, because we do have a little bit of feedback on the microphone system. So first to talk about the overall outcomes of the Economic Investment Conference and what the aims and achievements were of that conference is Amal Kandeel. And Amal, you've had a lot of experience, I know, in the international development field, certainly in advising the public and private sectors on investment throughout the Middle East, but particularly in Egypt. You do a lot of advice, particularly on the geostrategic values, the political environment, the investment laws, and I know you're actually doing work there now, so you can actually speak to the practical accomplishments and achievements. So starting off, Amal, if you'd like to give some comments on what actually did the summit achieve and what has been the economic impact.
Thank you, Randa. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here with us today, and I thank the Middle East Institute, of course, for extending the invitation for me to be here. We are here to discuss updates on the economic and investment environment in Egypt. And one of the most recent of these has been the economic conference that's been held last month there. That conference has been one station along the way in the government's efforts to address significant economic challenges by planning and implementing reforms and other measures to restore confidence in the economy and revive investments there in order to ensure a higher rate of economic growth that would be supporting for development and would be inclusive. I want to note, just highlight two main tracks the government has been working on in the last 9 months or so to address these economic challenges. One of them has been the fiscal reforms, and the other has been the change to the regulatory framework for investment. When it comes to fiscal reforms, the government's plan is, which is very important for the investment environment, to be improved. The government's plan is to reduce the fiscal deficit and redistribute the savings to and pump them towards strengthening social safety nets and allocating more resources to education, health, R&D, and infrastructure, all of which again are vital for productivity and investment in Egypt. The reforms include measures, revenue measures that would expand the tax base, and include spending measures that focus mainly on eliminating the energy subsidy program within 5 years, as well as controlling the government wage bill. Now, when it comes to the legal framework for investment, a new law was issued just ahead of the economic conference in March, which included important provisions for the private sector, both FDI and domestic investment. I just want to note here why it is important to improve the investment environment in Egypt, including particularly for FDI. Well, there is a problematic situation in Egypt that needs to be fixed, and that is low productivity. With low productivity, we have low incomes, and that means low rates of savings, and that means low investment rates, and so that brings us back to low productivity, and we have a closed cycle. So there's a need to strengthen the role of FDI in Egypt in order to break that cycle from, with a solution from outside the box. And that is also why the conference, of course, was held. The conference had two principal goals. One of them was to present the investment landscape in Egypt and specific opportunities for investment in different sectors, the global investment environment community and the development community. And the other was to secure international partners for major projects that are important on the government's list of priorities, and hopefully to attract about $10 to $15 billion of investments. So as we have seen, of course, the conference attracted significant international attention and attendance from representatives of governments, international corporations, and development groups. And the results announced at the closing session of the conference are quite important. These were a total of $60 billion investments and loans, aside from $12.5 billion of assistance pledges from 4 GCC countries, which would also include investments, loans, and grants. The makeup of these $60 billion includes $36.2 billion in FDI contracts, $18.6 billion in the form of EPC agreements on infrastructure projects, and $5.2 billion in loans. And the values of MOUs signed, memorandums of understanding signed, are not included in this figure. The other most important result of the conference has been a very welcome concentration of investor interest, including both contracts and MOUs in the energy sector. Egypt has a significant potential for energy sector development, but it also has significant shortages now in fuel and electricity supply that's negatively affecting productivity in all sectors of the economy and, of course, the quality of life there. Within the energy sector, electricity infrastructure projects, which include distribution networks as well as power plants, got the lion's share of contracts and MOUs, and these were a total of about $43.5 billion, which is double the amount that the oil and gas sector attracted, which was $21 billion. The total capacity involved in these electricity production contracts and MOUs is a little over 8 gigawatts, of which Siemens is going to provide 6.6 gigawatts in a contract that's already been signed with the government of Egypt. And based on an MOU with the government, Siemens would also propose an additional 6.4 gigawatts of electric power production installations. These numbers are significant because Egypt's total capacity of electric power production installed is 27 gigawatts, and the actual the daily peak demand is 24 gigawatts. We should also note that usually installation the capacity installed is higher than the actual capacity produced. So it's usually about 80%, which is the rough common figure in the industry. So we have 21 gigawatts, which is less than the peak demand. The electric power projects agreed on in these contracts and MOUs include both renewable energy and conventional energy plants. There were also other commitments in other sectors, such as transport, real estate, tourism, trade, and logistics, in varying amounts. Now, I just want to make a few comments on these results. They're all from just one snapshot in time. And it would be reasonable to expect over time, in the weeks and months to come, more results to emerge as three things happen. First, MOUs would be turned into actual contracts. Second, this inertia created by this three-day event would generate more interest from other companies that have been watching the recent developments. And of course, with the start and implementation of these important energy projects, they would create an important breakthrough in dealing with an obstacle that's been standing in the face of production investment in Egypt in all sectors. So I just want to finally note a few things here about signs of economic improvement that we've been seeing in the last, just within the last year, broadly speaking. We have seen a healthy increase in economic growth in the last quarter of 2013, 2014, as well as the first quarter of 2014-15. And now the growth forecasts for 2015 have been revised up by both the IMF and Moody's to 4 to 4.5%. And I believe Moody's also revised forecast for 2016 to 5 to 6%. We've also seen an increase in tourism revenue by 25% between 2013 and 2014, which is an important barometer for security perceptions in the country. And lastly, I just want to refer quickly to the fall in the oil prices over the last several months, which is going to help the government achieve its subsidy removal plan, and is also estimated to reduce the percentage of the subsidy bill, the share of the subsidy bill as a percentage of GDP by about 2 percentage points, so from 6% to 4%. That's it for me. I just want to say that the important thing that I'm noticing and I'm seeing is that the economy's engines are now better engaged in significant investments and activities, and the wheels are turning. So it's like in the longer term, the effect would be like throwing some rocks in a pond that was somewhat stagnant and watching the formation of ripples as a result. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Amal. We'll now turn to Hisham Fahmy, who is CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt. Hisham, if I could take this public opportunity to thank you for all your hard work over the many years since I think I first met you when I was on Capitol Hill as a staffer. I very much, and certainly I'm sure others in the audience and throughout Washington, appreciate your constant engagement. You are probably one of the best ambassadors Egypt has because of the private sector activity and your links to the American corporate community, as well as your understanding of politics here in Washington. And so today we'd certainly love to hear from you as a participant and one that was certainly had the front seat in the conference. What exactly is the business and investor mood like, particularly in Egypt? And I know Khush is going to talk to us about the American companies. And what is the investment mood? How is it changing? And what is the ramifications of it?
I'm glad you didn't ask me to do my prepared notes because Amal Kandeel just said everything I was going to say. There it goes. So you're talking about the mood for investment, right?
Food for investment, particularly on behalf of the Egyptians. You know, the internal Egyptian, community, the people, the investment environment, and the folks, throughout the region that are really going to be and have been putting the money into these projects, $60 billion worth.
Well, I think let me just start by echoing what Amal said, really. There was so much skepticism about this conference before it started. Nobody could believe that Egypt could do it in that time frame, and we were all saying, oh, maybe we should postpone it. And I think everybody, especially in this town, and they were really worried about what's going to happen. They did do it on time. We worried again how many people will show up, especially political backing, and that, as Amal said, came through. The high level attendance, we actually, as AmCham, and we encouraged other associations in Egypt to not to go to the plenary sessions and allow the foreign investors to attend. So the Egyptian, because it was over capacity. I mean, there are 2,500 people there, and I think the place could only take 1,750 or something. So there was a lot of interest, and not only just bodies, but a lot of very important people. Half the people there were very important. The other half thought they were very important. So it was a good mix. But to stress, before I go into the Egyptian investors, to stress the corporate world, and I was so impressed by the panels and the speakers on the panels. When you have somebody like Jeff Imlet speak, but also and then the same panel you get the CEO of Siemens, and then you have the CEO of Unilever, and then you have who else? Well, Mr. Lagarde was there, and people from the World Bank, the IFC, the African Development Bank, Arab Bank for Development. All these were there, and they were all highly represented. So it gave a lot of backing, a lot of feeling that Egypt's being backed up by a lot of strong institutions, whether sovereign institutions or international financial institutions. I think one of the main, apart from the numbers, I think the numbers are very important, and they were staggering. Quite honestly, we didn't expect that much, and everybody says, "Well, it's all in energy and infrastructure." Well, yeah, and to have any kind of investment, you need the energy and the infrastructure. So that is a basis for moving forward for Egypt, and is definitely a welcome part of it. Of course, all this is going to come over a few years. I mean, these investments are not going to happen in 1 year's time. And you have to look at Egypt's capacity to actually absorb this kind of investment. What about the steel industry and the cement industry and so on? I think they can do it now in the next couple of years, but of all these, especially if the MOUs turn into contracts, it's going to be a lot of investment that is needed in infrastructure and building materials and so human resources. Do we have the talent to carry out all these investments and so on? We will be able to attract talent back from the Gulf to Egypt to do all these investments. That's another. Amal maybe didn't speak about some of the mega projects. I'm very fond of the Suez Canal development project. I think that's going to be something. The master plan looks fabulous. Again, it comes back to the implementation, when and how, and who's going to do it. I think these are very important questions to ask. Foreign exchange, how much money is needed for these investments to be put together? I think what's really interesting about these announced investments, Siemens and others, is they're bringing their own money. They're bringing finance from either from banks abroad or from their governments at very low interest rates, and you'll have to tell us about that. There will be, of course, a local component. All the studies look that maybe all these investments will need about 20% in local funding, and at the moment, Egyptian banks are very liquid in local currency. So I think that can be happen. If we're talking about Egyptian investors, I think all the big boys have decided to put their money where their mouth is. The Sawiris family, whether it's Naguib, Nasif, or Samih, each in his own thing, except Naguib is in everything. I mean, I think he's doing a $100 million project in solar, plus other issues. Orascom Construction are doing other things. Palm Hills Development, originally Mansour family, they're expanding. I think they have already 3 other big projects, including the one they have now. They're going to be expanding. There are a couple of joint ventures that are going to be happening with Arab and foreign companies, foreign Egyptian investors. So the mood is, if Egyptians are putting their money in Egypt, I mean, that's the first start. I think that is very important, and I'm going to leave it to Khush to talk about U.S. investments and so on. Am I taking too long? Just to mention what AmCham Egypt, American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt, has been doing to support the conferences. We started by our leadership and our board being ambassadors for the conference 3-4 months before, going abroad and spreading the word. But also we took care of the U.S. investors and looked at the companies already in Egypt and said, how are you doing? And they were all doing fine. So we actually put them on video as testimonials, and the conference website took those with our permission, put them on their website. So these were testimonials of what companies are doing already in Egypt. And after the Sharm, there's a lot more interest. We worked very hard with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on promoting the conference and also sending the word out. We started a year and a half ago, something called Egypt for Business campaign, Egypt for Business, with our partners, Cambridge Group, I think they're here. And just telling the story about business in Egypt. We're not talking about politics, we're talking business, how companies are doing, how are they investing, why are they investing, and so on, and putting it in sectorial periodicals like The Banker or Fashion Magazine, tourism, all the trade publications. I think we have a lot to do more after Sharm. The government has a lot to do to implement what they promised. They put a vision forward, which I thought was the first time we've seen an Egyptian government actually put a vision, whether you like it or not, whether you think they'll get the KPIs right or not. But it was really refreshing, and they did it very well. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Hisham. So now we turn to Chris Jarvis. Chris, you've spent most of your career at the IMF, first in the UK, is that right? And then in Europe, I think Ukraine and Belarus, and now in the Middle East, so you've covered a lot of the world. And we've seen the slow re-engagement, I would say, of Egypt with the IMF. Again, I know you were at the summit itself. Can you tell us a little bit about what you have been doing in this past year, particularly with the re-engagement and your interactions with Egypt and how the IMF has been assisting Egypt on the economic front?
Sure. Well, first, let me say thanks to the Middle East Institute for inviting me to speak to you, and thanks to everybody for coming on a potentially rainy afternoon. We have had steadily increasing engagement with Egypt over the past year or so. We've been providing technical assistance in the budget. We went in November, a number of us, on what we call an Article 4 consultation mission, which is essentially medical metaphors are used a lot with the IMF. It's a kind of annual checkup of economies. But it was the first checkup of that kind of Egypt for almost 5 years. So it was very good to be able to do that and to have a real dialogue with the government and the central bank about economic policies and about prospects. And I'll talk a little bit about those economic policies in a minute. At the beginning, you said that we had a front row seat to the summit. So maybe just a little bit of a reaction on what the conference was like.
Mm-hmm.
First, Sharm El-Sheikh's a fantastic place to have it. I mean, it's always fun to go to Egypt because it's such a lively, vibrant place, and Sharm El-Sheikh is absolutely beautiful. And I know that our managing director, Christine Lagarde, was totally blown away by how beautiful Sharm El-Sheikh is. There was also tremendous energy at the conference. You really got a feeling of lots of people very interested in Egypt. Not only investors, but journalists. You had people from all over the world coming. There was at one point a little bit too much energy, in fact. This room reminds me a little bit of the conference hall in that throughout the conference centre they had little raised platforms where companies had their setups and people could come and have meetings. And they were raised, but they were not as high as this platform. They were raised about 2 or 3 inches off the ground. And the result of that is that people often didn't see them. So you'd be there having a meeting, and every few seconds somebody would go by and trip over as they went over the platform.
Wow.
But it was obviously a very successful conference, and I'll talk a little bit about how we think the conference fits into the economic context in a minute. Just to give you a sense of how we see the economy first, though. Returning to that medical metaphor, we focus on some key indicators in the same way that you might look at pulse and blood pressure. And let me focus on 4 of those indicators: growth, inflation, the budget deficit, and the external position. First, growth. Egypt has had low rates of growth since the revolution, and even before the revolution it had a problem generating inclusive growth. We're projecting a growth rate of about 4% this year, rising to maybe 5% over the medium term, but it could be higher, and it really needs to be higher, because Egypt has very high unemployment, and you need higher growth to bring that down. If I was giving just a couple of figures to remember and take away, I would give these, which is that 1 in 3 young people is unemployed, and participation by women in the labour force is 1 in 4. Those are numbers that have to be brought down in the first case and up in the second if Egypt's going to succeed. And in our thinking about Egypt, we focus on policies that are going to bring about growth and jobs. That's our first priority for Egypt. Inflation is another thing we look at. We think it's going to be around 10%, maybe a little bit higher this year. That's pretty consistent with previous years. It's important to contain inflation and, if possible, to bring it down. And the central bank has plans to do that gradually over the next few years. The budget deficit is an indicator that causes more concern. It's been running at over 12% of GDP for the last 3 years or so. The government has a target of bringing it down to 10 to 10.5% of GDP this year. We are a little more pessimistic than them on whether they'll succeed in doing that. At the moment, I would say we think it's going to be between 11 and 12. And it's important not to let it go too high, because public debt is already over 90% of GDP. The interest on that debt is already eating up about a quarter of the budget. So it's really important to contain that, and to do that, it's important that the government stick to its plans on subsidies reform and on tax reform, including introducing the VAT, and also that it takes steps to protect the poorest people from the effects of those measures. And then finally, on the external side, Egypt's current account deficit is not off the charts compared to other countries. The current account deficit is a kind of major measure that we use comparing exports minus imports of goods and services. And we see it coming in between 3 and 5% of GDP, which is maybe a little higher than it should be, but not wildly so. What's maybe more of a problem is that reserve coverage is quite low. It's about $15 billion at the moment, the central bank's reserves, which are about 2.5 months of imports. And that's not really enough for a country of Egypt's size and with Egypt's needs. So we see two things as being important for that. We see exchange rate flexibility as being important, and we welcomed the move by the central bank to allow the exchange rate to depreciate a little bit earlier this year. And we also see finance as being important, because the financing needs are not going to go away immediately, even with the best policies in the world. And Sharm El-Sheikh was important from that perspective. Let me talk a little bit about how the conference fits into that broader macroeconomic picture. I'd focus on two things. First, that $60 billion figure for investments. Very welcome, a very good sign of confidence in Egypt, and also very important, especially in some of the infrastructure sectors, that investment take place. But a couple of questions about it and a couple of caveats. One question is it firm? How much of that $60 billion will actually be delivered? And is it for the right things? Our take on the investment needs in Egypt is that the focus should be on creating jobs in the short term and promoting growth in the medium term, increasing Egypt's potential growth, and especially on things which will generate exports of goods and services and help with that external problem. And a very good case in point, actually, is the Suez Canal project itself, which is creating jobs through construction at the moment, and it will also both add to growth and add to Egypt's capacity to export shipping services in this case in the future. So that's a good example, but it'll be important as the Egyptian government evaluate these investment proposals to think about what their priorities are, and we would propose that they look at those two criteria in evaluating proposed investments. Now, the other thing about investment finance is, first, it doesn't come in all at once, it comes in over years. And second, it's generally tied to imports. So it doesn't help with that balance of payments financing gap issue that we see as a short-term problem. What did help with that was the $6 billion in balance of payments commitments from Saudi Arabia, UAE and Kuwait, $2 billion each essentially, which is money that will be dispersed over the next month or two, and that will add to reserves and increase Egypt's capacity to make payments in the short term. We do see, though, more financing gaps emerging next fiscal year, and it'll be important both for policy measures which help bring down those financing gaps, and that subsidies reform, tax reform, exchange rate flexibility are all policies which will do that, and also, especially in the case of subsidies reform and exchange rate flexibility, contribute to growth and jobs. But it'll also be important that there's financing for Egypt. And that could be from the Gulf countries, it could be from others, it could be from the IMF. Now maybe just conclude a little bit by coming back to the relationship between Egypt and the IMF. What can we do for Egypt? When Christine Lagarde met President Sisi, he welcomed the improvement in the relationship, and he said he'd like the IMF to do more for Egypt. So what can we do? Well, first, we can provide objective advice. And our Article 4 consultation that we had last year is an example of that kind of advice. And if anybody wants to read the report, it's available online at the IMF's website. And for a more condensed version, you could also read Christine Lagarde's speech at the conference, which is also on the IMF website. we can also provide technical assistance, and we've been doing that in a number of areas, especially on the budget over the last year or so. And if requested, we can provide finance, including helping catalyse finance from others, and at very low interest rates. And with IMF finance comes credibility as well, because that finance is tied to the continuation of a country's own economic reform programme. Just to conclude, Christine Lagarde has said a number of times that the IMF is ready to help Egypt, and she said at the conference, "We're only a phone call away." We are not going to press Egypt. This is entirely a decision for the Egyptian government and the central bank, what they want to do, whether they want to fund program, whether they want to do something entirely different. And the policies are theirs. But we will always be there to answer the phone if the phone call comes. And if Egypt needs us, we'll be there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for your perspective and your participation. Khush. So Khush Choksy is presently the Vice President at the U.S. Chamber for Turkey and the Middle East. You've had a long history at the Chamber, but you are and were and still are primarily responsible for growing the U.S.-Egypt Business Council. You've had quite a bit of experience in the Middle East. And you have an interesting and unique perspective in that you work with U.S. companies, but you're also based here in Washington, D.C., which we all like to think we are the center of the universe. So, Khush, can you talk a little bit about the U.S. companies' participation? And I know there were some extraordinarily terrific pledges by some U.S. companies and announcements, if you will, but also interweave that with a Washington perspective, particularly on the policy issues, and I'll certainly follow up with some questions on that.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you to Wendy and the Middle East Institute for hosting us, and thank you, Randa, for moderating this panel and all of your efforts leading up to it. Thank God Washington is not the center of American business. It may be of politics, but thankfully not of business. I'll come back to that later on. But just in terms of the perspective of American business, there has never been a period, certainly, and I've been working on Egypt issues for the last 20 years, that there has been as much American business optimism in Egypt as there is today. And that's important to note. And I think the political cycle is way behind, certainly in terms of Washington, in terms of reflecting that optimism. The second thing is that over the course of the last year, certainly from the perspective of American business, the macroeconomic situation is a lot better than it was prior to President Sisi taking office. And we see that in a very tangible way. Companies are no longer feeling as much the pinch they did in terms of accessing hard foreign currency. Just one example. All of that said, I mean, Chris has spoken to the macroeconomic issues very well. I would just like to add that we do think that Egypt engaging with the IMF in whatever sense is a good thing, because it will help enhance international investor credibility and help enhance the flow of capital to Egypt. And particularly as Egypt looks to access money from the international bond market, which we think will go very easily, very quickly, but it will help the overall flow of capital in all of its different forms to Egypt. And that's something that the American business community would applaud, again, in terms of whatever further engagement the IMF and Egypt have. In terms of the Sharm conference, I mean, clearly, since you mentioned Washington, Secretary Kerry being there, he keynoted a big breakfast that we did with our companies. Many Egyptian governmental and certainly business leaders were there. We did it in conjunction with our partner AmCham in Egypt and the Egypt-US Business Council and the US-Egypt Business Council. For the perspective of our companies, clearly it was a very helpful, useful forum. They got to meet a lot of the players in one place. As the companies look to the future, and you've had a number of CEO visits, you've had the CEOs of at least half a dozen of the largest 20 American companies that have visited Egypt in the last year. That in itself is an indicator of serious business, not just interest, but tangible efforts to enhance their portfolio in Egypt. It's important for Egypt to pursue the macro projects that it's talked about, but it's also equally important for it to pursue the reforms very vigorously that it's talked about, whether it's the investment law, the companies law, because the focus in terms of there are already over 60 American companies, very large companies that have an ongoing business and presence in Egypt. The ability to be able to, for those companies to expand their presence in Egypt and grow will be of significant immediate value and of a sustainable value. Again, I'm not in any measure or form, I think that the macroeconomic projects, be they in the infrastructure space which is needed, be they in the immediate job creation impact that they cause significantly, those are very important. But let's not forget that the sustained growth, 3, 4, 5 years after these projects end, come from existing businesses. And as those companies grow, they transfer knowledge, they transfer best practice, and it's a very broad portfolio of American companies, our members, that are invested in Egypt. So what we'd like to see is the sustained and rapid implementation of the economic reforms, the new laws. And I would like to add anything both at the ministry level and as in terms of a one-stop shop for foreign investors that Egypt can implement will be very helpful. For example, to say a positive story, and also something that Egypt can do to enhance that positive story. We have had tremendous cooperation in the healthcare sector for our companies that manufacture in Egypt. So, kudos to Egypt for all of the help that they've given us. The next level would be to create the mechanisms for a public-private sector dialogue in the healthcare sector that will be able to address very legitimate issues that that American companies, Egyptian companies, other players in that broad sector have. But the creation of that dialogue, the creation of a strategy, our companies are willing to invest in a strategy to develop Egypt's healthcare sector would be very helpful, again, to drive growth in a sustained area. And you can go sector by sector. So in a nutshell, very positive. And then there are things that Egypt should and can do and is doing. I really do want to accentuate the positive here, is doing that can be taken to the next level. The last thing, not to avoid your question with regards to Washington, again, as a business association, we don't speak to the politics of it, but it's clearly the fact that American companies are ahead and are out there. We would like to see as much as our Congress, our government can do to support American business. And a concrete example of that we have proposed is the first strategic dialogue between the United States and Egypt. And having that dialogue would be of tremendous help. And having a large economic and business component to that dialogue would be something that the U.S. Chamber would call for and support, as our companies would.
Right. Terrific. Thank you. Thank you. So why don't I ask each one of you a quick question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and I'll work my way backward here. So, Khush, sort of staying on this theme, I think one issue that we sometimes can't ignore is when the private sector, business, economic issues collide with the political issues. And I imagine you are on the front lines of that, being the U.S.-Egypt Business Council, because you want your members to continue to do business there. But there are issues. So the U.S. government on a daily basis has to weigh U.S. national security interests, which oftentimes involve economic interests, with human rights issues. And as we constantly hear the beat of the drum from some of the major media outlets regarding some human rights issues, particular cases in Egypt, and overall the environment there. And so my question is, how do those political issues, particularly when you have members of Congress or the administration focusing on that, how does that affect your member base, your ability to do business there, and your engagement at the Chamber?
And there are two sides to every coin, so I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of the political issues. Different people have different opinions, different interpretations, and they can debate that back and forth. The reality as far as American business goes is Egypt is a stable, growing, investable market. It has always been a strong economic partner and a friend of American business, and it is doing all of the right things. I mean, one of the things that we talk about in terms of American values is competitive markets and open economies. Egypt is doing all of those types of things and is doing it more rapidly than has ever in its history. I think that that argument is often forgotten. We talk about American values. Well, what about our business values? What about the types of things in terms of competition that we encourage, in terms of a level playing field? And I think that we forget when we talk about Egypt that those values are being implemented extremely rapidly, and we commend Egypt for that.
Great, thank you. So Chris, I have been curious myself because I've heard rumors, and I'd like to know whether or not you know. Have you seen, or do you know, that Egypt is developing an economic plan, a 5-year economic plan? And I've also heard that the famed businessman and economist and a proud Egyptian American, Mohammed Al-Arian, is involved in advising the government. What, if anything, do you know about that? And is that something that the IMF looks at, of course, favorably, if indeed that does exist?
I'm not aware of a 5-year plan, but there is certainly planning which covers the next several years,
Okay.
Both in individual sectors and for investments, and also for the budget. And the government has been very explicit in its fiscal and external debt targets, targeting a reduced deficit and a turnaround and a reduction in debt, in public debt, over the next 5 years. The central bank has an inflation target which stretches out 4 to 5 years into the future, and that's very good. I mean, you need to plan for the medium term and set this year's policies in the context of the medium term. Of course, the plan has to be capable of being adjusted to what happens in year one. But I mean, the Egyptian government has demonstrated flexibility to adjust in that kind of way in the past. Mohammed Al-Arian's an ex-IMF alumnus as well, and somebody who has very interesting ideas and who we listen to carefully. But the impression I have is that both the Egyptian government and President Sisi personally have many advisors and listen to many people, and that's a good thing too.
Great, great. Well, terrific, terrific. Hisham, I want to drill down on something that everybody's talked about but not elaborated on, and that's the subsidy reform issue. How is the government going to be able to present that, or how have they presented that to the Egyptian people? How is that going to go over in Egypt? How is that going to be implemented to the benefit of the business community? Particularly, I'm interested, of course, in the energy area, but subsidies all across the board.
With difficulty. I think the subsidy issue is one of the hardest thing that the Egyptian government has to tackle. They have plans to tackle it. I think they have to continue on the reform. I'm not sure how quickly they will continue to implement, especially energy subsidy. But they've had successes in and this is a story that hasn't been told a lot, is the bread distribution system that was implemented several months ago. Not several months, about 6 months ago. For a time, ordinary Egyptians would queue for hours. I mean, hours. I mean, talking like 6-7 hours just to go and get their bread, which is heavily subsidized. And it was just a mess, and there began to be fights in the queues, and actually one person was killed in one of those in these fights. But they came up with a smart card system, which tells you how technology helps in these things. Is now they decided, okay, each person can get 5 loaves of bread at subsidized price. And you go, and every time you get your 5 loaves, and if you're a family of 5, it's 5 times 5 daily, or you can take the whole amount for the month together that you put in your card. But if you don't take your 5 loaves, you take 2 loaves, then you have credit for 3 loaves. And the amount of money, which say the loaf is 5 piastres, or it's half a cent or something. And so you have 3 loaves that you did not take. So that's 5 times 3, that's 15. The government will add another 15 to that, and you can go to the local corporates and buy oil and sugar and so on with the credit that you have. Mm-hmm. It has done 2 things. It stopped people just getting as much bread as they want or they don't want and throw it away and give it to sheep and chicken and whatever because it's cheap. It stopped. They also did it with the bakers because they give them so many pounds of wheat, and the card tells them how much they spent, so they can't, because they used to take the subsidized wheat and give it to other people who sell it at triple the price and do expensive bread. So it's broken a cycle, and now people are just so happy with this system that they want to implement that in the butane gas bottles, which is now the problem, and the queuing and so on. So it just shows there are innovative ways of solving a lot of these issues and technology. I think Egypt must continue the reform on subsidies because the drop in oil prices has given them a cushion, and I'm worried they're going to use that cushion to delay it a little bit.
Right. Unusual opening. Great. And finally, Amal, ostensibly there are some folks here in the audience who are with small and medium-sized American companies or international companies, or advising those companies. If you were to do a report card for them, those types of companies that may not have a strong appetite for risk that perhaps the larger multinational companies can, what are some of the factors that you would advise these companies to look at, and what type of report card would you give Egypt right now as far as that investment environment for small and medium-sized enterprises?
Well, one of the things that I had in mind when I was looking at all this and looking at the details that are coming out around the conference with the new investment law is actually looking for more specific and clear incentives for small and medium enterprises. Mm-hmm. And I personally found this missing. So the law doesn't really address them directly. I looked carefully. It's a big document with, I think, at least 80 different provisions, and it's not even a straightforward document. It actually pulls from 5 different laws and changes things from these 5 different laws and puts them in one document. So in order to really understand all what's going on, we have to go back and look at the 5 other documents as well. So for me, it's not clear. There was a lot of talk about special incentives for SMEs. They're very important in Egypt, as they are very important in the United States. Mm-hmm. They are responsible for about 80% of employment and GDP, roughly speaking. So I can understand why it's important for SMEs in the United States to want to see also a clearer perspective on what's going on. I think one of the important things, in any case, that have been achieved in the law, or a few of the important things, simplification of the startup process, which became, as mentioned here in the panel, it's a one-stop shop now to get licenses or permits. Usually it can take, for example, as just one example, an agribusiness in land reclaimed area, desert reclaimed land areas in Egypt, you could need up to 7 permits from 7 different ministries to get your land recorded and registered. So now that's just an example in agribusiness. So now you don't have to go to 7 different places to get your final license. You can get it from one place. And the time for receiving this license has been reduced significantly. There are also incentives that are, again, they're not specified whether they're for SMEs or large enterprises, but there are incentives for certain companies working under certain specific conditions. If they use local labor, if they work in disadvantaged and remote areas. But from my perspective, these are conditions that would probably be difficult for SMEs, perhaps medium enterprises, yes, but not for small enterprises to work in. So I don't want to sound negative about this. I personally did see something missing when it comes to SMEs. But still, overall, the environment is much simpler than before. It's much more open. At least we have now equality between foreigners and nationals in owning businesses and renting land and dispensing of land and so on. The government is also very keen to encourage certain types of projects. So the government would, in fact, allocate land to certain projects, and that would include small and medium types of enterprises entering the market with projects that are designated as such for the government to allocate state land for. So the incentives are mixed, but the environment is much better. And the report card, I think, is tremendously better than the last 2-3 years. I am hoping that it would reach a level that would be similar to the vibrant environment that existed in the last few years just before the revolution. So yes, the report card is much better because of simplification. There are some mixed signals, but they are affecting all types of enterprises, small, medium, and international. And some of them really are not related to the internal environment in Egypt. They could be geopolitical risks associated with things that just flare up and change from time to time. Some of them is also related to the government credit risk, which affects all enterprises again. So my answer is mixed on this. So I hope that helps.
No, that's great. That's terrific. Okay, now we're happy to open up the questions to audience. We do have a microphone. And of course, the chair, Wendy, Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain. So happy to have you here with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for 4 really very good presentations that I particularly like because they're optimistic. And Randa, thank you for good questions. One of your questions referred to Mohammed El-Arian, and I would just like to give a little spoiler alert or maybe a preview. The Middle East Institute will be honoring him at our annual conference this November. I think it's November 12th, isn't it? So the tables are going to go fast. You're the first to know.
Great.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Here's my question. Decades ago, I served in Malaysia, and Prime Minister Mahathir had a pretty good model for encouraging foreign direct investment, and that was he named a no-nonsense minister for commerce, or I think it was commerce, foreign investment, whatever. And she had direct access to him, and she had rights to give instructions to any other ministry. So if an investor would come and complain, it's taking too long to get work permits or whatever the complaint was, she could go to that ministry and give an instruction to speed it up. And it created an atmosphere that attracted foreign investment by the billions. Is there a model like that anywhere in the Middle East? I don't know. Or is there a notion of talking about it in Egypt?
Who'd like to take that? Hisham?
Yeah, there is a person, Sisi. We actually have a very, very active Minister of Investment who really takes on the other ministries to task. And he's had a lot of success in the last few months, 6-7 months. And I think he's doing a great job, and I think maybe he needs more authority, probably. But he's doing a grand job, and he has direct access to the man.
Terrific.
Maybe I can add a little bit.
Great, yeah, absolutely.
It's an intriguing idea, and I also found the investment minister very dynamic, and I know he's tried to simplify the process. We would say, though, don't just look at one thing that they could do, look at a range of things. For example, Egypt ranks 112th among the countries in the World Bank's Doing Business Indicators list at the moment. Why not shoot for the top 50? Right. Think about the things you need to do that are in that index to improve Egypt's performance and get them up there. I think Egypt could do it.
Great. Great. So we have a microphone here. Your name, affiliation, your question. Please ask a question, and if you'd like, direct it to a specific panelist. Yes, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mahfouz Tadros, former World Bank staff. First of all, I would like to thank the panel for a very positive assessment and a very real one, particularly Mr. Choksy. He has really delivered a very important message, and that is the business community. The U.S. business community is watching what's happening in Egypt and watching it very positively. I'm not saying that's the end of it. The road ahead of us in Egypt is long, but the present government has taken the initial steps. And I think that's a very good sign, and I hope they can continue with the one-stop shop, with the Minister of Investment, and with other things. On Doing Business report, Egypt has been, at one point, one of the top stars. You know, the ranking shifts from year to year, and I'm sure Egypt will do it with the one-stop shop, with the investment law, with making it easy to do business. I'm very hopeful. Thank you very much.
You don't have a question?
I don't have a question.
Oh, let's get a question. That's good comment. Thank you. Thank you for your comment.
Hi, I'm David Willey from George Mason University. Thank you very much for coming. And I'm also very glad that you've expressed a lot of optimism for Egypt's economic future. We love Egypt. We all hope that it's going to do well. My question is sort of the basis of that optimism. From what I understand, Egypt under Mubarak had some market-oriented reforms, opened up, wanted to attract more FDI, did a lot of the same things that we're seeing Sisi implement now, and there was stagnation that eventually led to the revolution. My question is why you think this situation is any different, and what the basis of your optimism is. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Want to direct that to a particular panelist, or you want any one of them to?
Khush, maybe?
Sure. You know, I think the comparison between the market reforms that were done in the latter part of the Mubarak years, I think that the reforms process had become stagnant, and I think it wasn't just market reforms. There may have been political issues that caused revolutions. They were political issues, so they were not necessarily economic issues. And there were issues, legitimate issues, with regards to how broad that economic base had benefited. And I mean, no one can look to the future, but one would hope that the benefits of the economic reforms are very broad based in terms of the beneficiaries. And then just would like to come back, and one way to make that very broad based is, and Wendy, you did ask a very good question. I think that you do need a combination of a strong economic czar, but particularly in a very large, broad country like Egypt, it's important that throughout every of those ministries, health or agriculture very broadly, that the reform process is instituted, and that it's business friendly, and the doing business indicators are addressed across all of those broad areas. I think if you do that broadly, then I think you would have an economy that is very different from the economy that emerged out after the Mubarak years.
Yes. The young woman in the peach colored jacket, yes.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. I'm a student at the George Washington University. My question is also for Mr. Choksy. I was wondering if you could speak to how the plans for the new capital city that also came out during this conference affect U.S. Feeling towards investment, and how this will affect U.S. business relations in the future.
Sure. I mean, I think that from the perspective of an American company, if it's a large, capital cities, large infrastructure projects, the companies would be very interested. It's not going to affect any type of relations negatively. It's only positive. It's just another good investment opportunity.
Terrific. Yes, in the back. Manal.
Manar Ghunaim, Middle East News Agency, Egypt. My question is for Mr. Khush regarding the decline of the oil prices now in the Gulf, and the concerns that is now raised about maybe some reduction of the Gulf investments in Egypt regarding to this decline of the prices. So do you think that the American chamber now is taking this into consideration, and they can make an offset for such a decline of the Gulf investments in Egypt? And how do you think about, as you said, that the American businessmen are now so optimistic for Egypt investment future? So do you think that the American businessmen can do this? And again, for Mr. Chris, how is your assessment regarding this decline of the Gulf oil prices for Egypt's future? Thank you.
Sure, maybe I'll respond to the first part of that question then. Decline in oil prices traditionally lead to more investment because the cost of investment or certain aspects of the cost of investment is lower. So we don't see the decline in oil prices impacting negatively investment. I can't speak to Gulf investment, but I certainly think that the decline in oil prices is not going to lead to a decline in American investment. And more pertinently, a decline in oil prices often leads to greater consumer demand, and therefore. Again, that speaks to the fact that we don't see a decline in investment. And also, last but not least, companies take a very long-term view to investment. So again, the decline in oil prices is not necessarily a bad thing that would impact any type of investment into Egypt.
Our sense is that the decline in oil prices will help Egypt. Especially it'll help the budget because it'll reduce the subsidies bill. It will help the balance of payments a little bit, but not a whole lot, because Egypt imports only slightly more in the way of oil products than it exports. In the longer term, we have wondered about whether there might be less investment in the oil and gas sector in Egypt because of the lower oil price, and with international oil companies cutting back their general investment budgets. The evidence from the conference seemed to suggest that actually oil and gas companies are still very interested in Egypt, but we will see. And on the budget side, I would agree with other speakers that it's important that the Egyptian government doesn't treat the fall in oil prices as a reason to delay subsidies reform. We rather see it as an opportunity to complete the subsidies reform earlier than could otherwise have been done.
Great. Randa, can I add something here, please?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just one point I'd like to add from also evidence from the conference. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have shown significant interest across almost all the sectors that received commitments of investments during the conference. Real estate, energy production, a little bit in trade and logistics. So, and that's about 8-9 months now since the beginning of the fall in the oil prices. So at this point, there's no indication that they are less interested. They're also, in addition, they consider stability in Egypt very important for them. So there's a strategic angle why cooperation, I think, is expected to continue on the economic and investment side. They understand, of course, there's a very strong understanding that stability in Egypt is going to come with better economic conditions, and that requires investment. So also from a purely investors' angle, they do realize the opportunities in a big market like Egypt, especially with all the trade agreements Egypt has regionally and beyond. So there are a number of reasons why their interest would be sustained. And yes, companies do look into the medium term and not just immediately. And by the medium term, there are expectations that oil prices will start rising up again anyway. So
Definitely. Yes, the gentleman in the gray jacket.
Thanks very much. I'm George Dragnich, and a retired American diplomat, and my first assignment in the Foreign Service was Cairo a very long time ago. My question is for Ms. Kandeel, because you talked about SMEs, but keying off what Chris Jarvis said about doing business indicators, one of the things that those of us who've looked at entrepreneurship have seen is the punitive nature of Egyptian law if you fail. If you go into bankruptcy, there's a very high probability that you'll go to debtor's prison. Has that changed?
Okay, I looked at the law. Thank you for your question. I looked at the law carefully, and that I did not see that provision included in it in any shape or form. But what I can comment on are two things. First of all, well, that's not bankruptcy, but I think the essence of a change in the legal liabilities or the legal responsibilities of management or supervision in a company in Egypt, the essence of the change is to separate legal liabilities from administrative ones. And I have seen specifically a new provision that absolves a company from any criminal liabilities if the violations can be addressed in an administrative way. Like, for example, nobody got involved in violations on purpose or knowingly, or management was not aware. So the essence of the law is to remove the criminal liability part, unless there is a clear violation that requires the, involving criminal law. I do not believe if that issue was existed. I'm not aware that it has existed in the past, but it wouldn't be in a law like what I've seen this time. And the other thing that I do know, which might be very much related to what you're asking, is when companies now need to dissolve a business, whether for bankruptcy or other reasons, there's been a time limit, 120 days, I believe, when they notify the government authorities that they are liquidating and closing up shop. And if there are any liabilities for these companies, they have to be notified within that time frame. And if they're not, that's it. They consider themselves clear and they close shop, and that's it. I can look again carefully at the issue of bankruptcy, but I haven't seen anything that stood out, and I can tell you confidently, I do not believe that this would still stay, that being bankrupt wouldn't involve any criminal penalties at this point.
No, it used to be. No, it does. It does. It still does.
Bankruptcy?
It still does. If you take a loan out of the bank and you're not, you're personally liable, especially if you're entrepreneurship, and then you can't pay it back, then you can actually go to jail. But there are two things that are going to be covered. There's going to be a bankruptcy law that's it's already been drafted, and the second thing is they've introduced that you can have a company of one person, okay, and it can be a limited liability company. So if you can do I don't know what you call it, private proprietorship. Yeah, and a limited liability company. So that means they don't go back to your home and take your dog away.
Personal assets are protected.
But you would go to jail if you have a loan and you don't pay it, right? That's what you're talking about. Not just because you went bankrupt. Let's say if it's your own funding, your own capital. You're not going to go, right? So.
Great. Okay, do we have a question in the back? Yes.
Hi, my name's Meredith, and I'm a recent graduate from Barnard at Columbia University. I was wondering, going back to the issue of human rights, how do you see reforming the security apparatus, namely the police, affecting the economy, or will it be reformed, because that's still a big issue?
Who on the panel? Hisham?
Hisham.
Hisham, you're my friend. You get all the easy questions.
Listen, Egypt's going through, let's put it, a teething situation. I think the economy is doing great. It's doing well, and like Khush is saying, and everybody else on this panel is saying that there is great optimism on that. I think very, very quickly the Egyptian government's realizing that they have other issues, like the human rights issues, like the police apparatus, and so on. It's going to take longer because of what's going on, because of the terror attacks that we're seeing against the police and now against citizens and against electricity pylons and against other things. It's hard to balance that, and it's going to take time. I think we're all against any human rights violations, and that needs to be addressed. It's a balancing act, just like here when you start talking about privacy and people listening on your phone and so on. It's a different level of human rights, but I think it needs definitely to be addressed, and I'm sure there's going to be a very quick move to do that.
How do you think would be the best way for it to be addressed?
I'm not an expert about.
I guess without upending a lot of the economic reforms that have happened.
Say it again.
Without upending a lot of the economic reforms that have.
No, you don't need to upend economic reforms to reform your security service. It's just it's like education. You need training and enforcement, and make sure the implementation is right, and you have monitoring and evaluation of every single part of the cycle.
Great. Alex, I saw you had your hand up for a while.
Alex Jalabi, a retiring Egyptian-American business person. Anyone who has visited Cairo knows how crowded it is and how desperately needed a new capital is. But from a purely economic standpoint, I'd like to kind of hear the view of some of the panelists on kind of the feasibility of such a mega project at this time in Egypt's economic development, whether it's a positive or a negative, a net positive or net negative.
Mm-hmm. Great. Sure. If any of the panelists want to weigh in on that. Did you actually, I mean, you've seen the site, I've seen the proposed area west of Cairo, yeah?
I think you need to look at it.
East of Cairo? East, okay.
Yeah.
East of Cairo.
I think you need to look at it as, is it good to have that?
Yes.
Okay, so we're on the right track. Who's going to invest in it? And what are the investment mechanisms? So far, what we've learned is that the Emirati and other Abbar and other investors are going to undertake that investment, okay, with the Egyptian government coming in with a like a PPP. They will be shareholders by giving land, and they will get 20% of the residential area for free, residential apartments and so on, and they will share in the profits of the sale of other issues. So, and that has worked. I don't know if you remember Medinati. I think that's the same kind of module. So if it happens, I think it's great. I think it's going to come down, do the investors have the money to do it? The last I looked, they have a capital of $2 billion, and so that means they can maybe leverage another $2 billion. What's being said, what's being looked at says that for it to be finished to the first phase in 5-6 years, probably needs $6 billion. So.
And it would continue to be called Cairo because Cairo.
No, this is there's a competition now about choosing the name. I mean, the worst thing it could be was with another date, you know.
Well, I'll tell you some local politics. We
10th
did
of
that.
Ramadan, 6th of October.
Yeah.
26th of July.
They recently did that with an area north of Bethesda, Maryland, into Rockville, and
Yeah.
I'm not so sure the results were all that favorable. So I don't know about a public competition for that.
Yeah.
For the naming rights. Yes, indeed.
Does somebody want to?
Oh yeah. Does anybody else? Sorry.
No.
Anyone?
Maybe.
Yeah. Chris.
I would look at that project just like I would look at any other project, thinking about the same criteria. Does it create jobs in the short term? Does it create growth in the medium term? I don't know enough about the details of the capital project to make an assessment of that. I would say the Egyptian government needs to decide its own investment priorities, and there are areas of infrastructure which seem to me to be very high priorities. I can give an example relating back to one of those numbers that I talked about earlier, that women's labour force participation of 1 in 4. Now, the World Bank did a really interesting study on jobs in Egypt, essentially. It's a very large report, but it makes compelling reading. And there's a chapter there about the situation of women in the jobs market and why that participation rate's so low. One of the reasons is because commutes are quite long in Egypt, but men make longer commutes than women, and one reason for that is because the public transport isn't safe enough. So if you can invest in infrastructure and in security for that matter, which improves the safety of public transport, you can make women more willing and more able to participate in the labour market and directly raise your growth rate in an inclusive way by that.
Great. I'll get you next. I know you had your hand up.
Paul Sullivan,
Yeah, Paul.
National Defense University in Georgetown. I don't think this thing is on, but I think you'll hear me anyway. Egypt is a very youthful society. What are the investments that they will need to give them hope for their economic future? 2 or 3 or 4?
Great question. Amal? Sure.
Yeah, Paul, I think, again, we go back to the issue of SMEs in Egypt. I think it's an important one. One of the last surveys done about the youth in Egypt, which was, I think, is about 2008, 2009, or maybe 2010. But anyway, it was by UNDP, and it was looking at the perceptions about youth, about life and work and expectations, economic expectations, and so on. One of the things they found out was that youth were not so highly interested in, there was a high concentration of perceptions that the government would be responsible for their employment rather than the private sector. I think these perceptions need to change, and I think one of the things the government can do now, as it tries to do reforms and address the economic challenges and create jobs and so on, is part of the policy would be how to change those perceptions. Your question is, what would they want in order to address their hopes? These are their hopes. They want to be employed in the government. So there's a very high perception, a very high concentration of perceptions in that direction. But this is not going to address their hopes. Their hopes are to be independent, to be financially independent, to be employed, to have a life. And that's not going to provide this. So one first thing that needs to be done is to help change those perceptions somehow, awareness campaigns and so on, and then focus on how to help support the growth of SMEs in Egypt. There is a healthy SME sector in Egypt already, but I think it lacks support in terms of perhaps training, other kinds of incentives like marketing and so on. There's been a new initiative started in Egypt in the last month or so, which is called Your Project, مشروعك بالعربي, just your project. The government is presenting, or across all the different governorates in Egypt, portfolios of projects that they have studied somehow, perhaps in a basic way, and assessed their merits and so on, and then they're providing funding for young people who want to come forth and say, well, we want to invest in that. So they're helping in that way, and I think that's an interesting initiative. It would be very interesting to see what kinds of projects that they are presenting the youth communities with to take on from there. Perhaps, I would think in some way that they are aligned with the government's goals of development in different areas of the country. They should be in a way. So that is one way, I think, to absorb the energies of the youth, and we can't really meet their expectations the way they are on a large extent. I think the expectations just need to change a little bit, but they also need the support to find the hope that this will bring them the results they want. Being in business is just not easy. And it sounds like fun, exciting, but it's not an easy thing. And for a small enterprise just beginning, there is quite a bit of support that is needed in the beginning. And I think that's one thing the government needs to work on to provide more of in Egypt. I don't know if that answered a bit, at least, a lot of your questions. So.
Sure. I think there's a longer-term issue with youth, and it comes back basically to education. I've said it, I think, actually in this room before, that there are, on AmCham Egypt's website, we have 2,500 open vacancies for jobs. And at the same time, we have 34,000 CVs on our website, and they don't match. And it's been a year, and we renew it every year. So there's a huge skills gap. And these are being addressed by NGOs, they're being addressed a bit by governments, they're being addressed by the CSR work by our companies, multinational and US companies. So, and there are very good examples of like the Education for Employment Association, where they go and find employers and say what kind of people you want. So they train people in soft skills, in computers, in English language, and so on. And 80% of those who graduate are employed. So there are, as Amal says, a lot going on that people are trying to do, but it's a big country and a huge number of youths that are unemployed, unfortunately.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. The gentleman right here in the...
My name is Fadl Yaqub. Thank you. My name is Fadl Yaqub. I'm from the Egyptian Embassy, the Economic and Commercial Office.
Welcome.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the very interesting discussion. And also I would like to send special thanks to Khush and Hisham for the wonderful work that they are doing with us. But I feel like there is one issue which is not well addressed always here. I mean, maybe I can put it like not adequately addressed, which is trade. Trade, what I mean by trade is the operational level of trade. People coming from Egypt to sell their products here. I think this is a very important issue because one of the narratives that we are always here in the United States is the United States is the biggest trading partner for Egypt. And I'm sorry to say that that's not anymore. It's not even number 2. So, and because you know that even from the SMEs standpoint, trade in this level is one of the most important issue and most important area to move Egypt to the next stage of development. We also, of course, we acknowledge the importance of the economic exchange between the two countries. The United States is the most important economic partner for Egypt. It will continue to be this for not even the years to come, maybe for 2 decades to come. That is the issue that I would like to raise. Maybe I'm biased because I'm working for the commercial office, but this is my question.
Sure,
Thank you.
Sure, that's a great point. Thank you for raising that. Khush, do you want to talk a little bit about that trade issue and maybe the reasons why there has been a decline?
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons why there has been a decline is, quite frankly, that the Europeans have been, to their credit, much more aggressive in pursuing trade agreements. And in that vein, the Euromed trade agreement has been a facilitator for European companies to do business with Egypt. Several years ago, the US-Egypt Business Council, the US Chamber, together with our Egyptian counterparts, proposed a US-Egypt free trade agreement. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. And we know, how politicized trade has been in this country. It was just yesterday that Tom Donahue testified asking for trade promotion authority to be granted to the president. Unfortunately, the labor unions have played an overwhelmingly negative role, in my opinion, on this issue, and we have not seen an adequate impetus on the US implementing trade agreements, whereas the rest of the world has gone out aggressively doing that. In the case of Egypt, the Europeans have done it, and they are eating our lunch.
Anyone else on the panel? Great. Great. Well, thank you so much to Khush, Amal, Chris, and Hisham, and of course, Mark and Wendy at the Middle East Institute. Thank you so much. Thank you.